She had kept her head down for 3 years, and it had kept her alive. In the palace of Threnor, she was no one of consequence, a scribe in a forgotten corridor, the kind of woman courtiers looked through rather than at. She had no title worth noting, no beauty that demanded attention, no ambition that made itself visible. She arrived quietly and departed quietly, and filled the space between with silence and ink-stained fingers and the practiced art of being overlooked. She had not survived 3 years by accident. Beneath the dark fall of hair she never once pinned back, never allowed to be shifted by wind or candlelight or careless hands, there was a mark. Curved and precise, shaped like a crescent of pale silver against the back of her neck. The mark of the seer-born. The mark that carried a death sentence under the law of Threnor. For 3 years King Valdrek had walked past her without a second glance. And for 3 years she had watched him, closely, secretly, from the furthest possible distance, because on the very first day she arrived in his palace, her gift had surfaced without warning, and shown her something about him she had never been able to forget. He was cursed. It was killing him, and he did not know it. She had kept that knowledge buried beneath 3 years of silence. She had told no one. She had looked at nothing. Until the night he looked at her. The night King Valdrek of Threnor finally saw Miren, he did not sleep. Neither did she. Because by morning, nothing between them would ever be the same. 3 years earlier. The assessment hall was cold with the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Stone walls, high ceilings, narrow windows admitting gray winter light without warmth. The 14 women standing in the selection line had dressed carefully for the occasion. Several wore their finest clothes. One had pinned her hair with jeweled clips that scattered pale sparks across the stone floor. Miren had worn a dark dress with a high collar, and she had stood fourth from the left. The position was not accidental. She had learned young that visibility was a variable you could control. Not first in a line. First invited scrutiny. Not last. Last invited the lingering attention of a gaze with nothing left to move toward. Fourth was unremarkable. Fourth was the woman the eye passed over in its search for something more interesting at either end. She had been practicing invisibility for most of her life. She was very good at it by now. The other women were accomplished in ways she could not afford to be. The Lord's daughter to her left carried herself with the easy confidence of someone told since childhood that she was worth looking at. The merchant's daughter 3 places down wore a perfume that announced itself before she entered a room. They were not wrong to present themselves this way. In Threnor, selection for palace service as a royal scribe was considered genuine elevation, a 5-year term inside the palace walls, performing the clerical work that kept the kingdom's records accurate and its correspondence flowing. For most of them, it was ambition. For Miren, it was the only option her father had left her. 3 months ago, Ganeth of Craven had entered her name into the selection pool, without asking her opinion or offering explanation beyond the one already obvious to both of them. "You understand why," he had said. She had understood. The seer-born were being hunted again. The royal decree making it a crime to harbor a crescent-marked individual had been renewed and sharpened. New penalties, new bounties, and new hunters with authority to search without warrants. The outer provinces were being combed systematically. Craven was 3 days' ride from the capital, and it was not far enough. The inside of the palace was the one place the hunters would not search. One did not look for a condemned criminal in the king's own house. It was a ruthless calculation. It was also the only reason she was still alive. "Keep your head down," her father had said as she left. "Don't use the gift. Don't let anyone near your neck. Do not allow yourself to be noticed." She had given him her word. Now she stood in the assessment line and kept her chin at exactly the right angle. Low enough to discourage eye contact, not so low as to suggest concealment. Her hair fell forward, arranged with the casual precision of something unstudied. She breathed in the slow rhythm she used when she needed to appear completely at ease. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. No announcement, no fanfare. Just the clean, decisive sound of boot heels on stone, measured and unhurried, the rhythm of a man to whom haste had never been necessary, because the world arranged itself around him rather than the reverse. King Valdrek of Threnor walked into the hall. She had heard descriptions, that he was tall, cold, that he had governed Threnor for 6 years, with an efficiency that left no room for sentiment. That his eyes were the precise gray of a sky overcast so long the color had become permanent. That he had never taken a mate, and showed no inclination toward doing so. None of the descriptions had prepared her for the weight of his presence. It was not merely the height, though he was tall. It was the quality of his attention as he moved through the room. Absolute, economical, assessing everything and dismissing most of it before it had fully registered. She felt it from 4 feet away, a drop in temperature that her gift recognized instantly as something unnatural. His footsteps moved down the line. He paused at the first woman. Briefly, moved on. The second. Longer. Then on. The third. A moment. Then on. He stopped in front of her. Mirren stared at the floor. Her gift stirred beneath her sternum, pressing upward the way it always did in the presence of something significant, and she pushed it back down with everything she had. Not now. Not here. See nothing. His gaze moved on. She did not breathe again until he reached the far end of the line. 7 will be sufficient, he said. Those 4 and those 3 at the far end. Mirren was one of the 4. She arrived at the palace 5 days later with a single trunk and a name only partly her own. Her mother's family name, Vale, substituted for her father's, which was too recognizable in the capital. She was assigned a room in the scribe's corridor, a desk, a weekly schedule, and a stack of ledgers requiring cross-referencing that would consume the better part of a month. She sat down, opened the first ledger, and began the long, careful work of becoming invisible inside the king's own walls. 3 years is a long time to practice disappearing. Mirren had not expected to last 3 months. The palace was large but full of eyes and the sharp-edged curiosity of people with too much proximity to power and too little of it themselves. She had anticipated discovery within weeks, had steeled herself for the moment when someone would reach toward her carelessly, or when the wind would catch her hair, or when some angle of light would reveal what she was always covering. And yet, 3 months became 6. 6 became a full year. Somehow, improbably, it passed, and she was still here, still breathing, still unnamed by any hunter's list. She had developed a system. It had become as reflexive as breathing, the hair, always down. She owned 7 identical dark ribbons, none of which had ever been used. She had learned to sleep facing away from the door, with the back of her neck toward the wall. A habit so ingrained she woke disoriented on the rare nights she rolled over. She had not once worn her hair up, not even alone in her room on the hottest evenings of summer when every other woman in the corridor gathered their hair off their necks with relief. It was a small sacrifice. She had made larger ones. Mirren had made one genuine friend among the scribes. His name was Orvin, lean, sardonic, from the western provinces, and wholly unimpressed by ambition in any of its forms. He had been in the scribe's corridor for 2 years before her arrival, and approached life with the settled resignation of someone who had made peace with obscurity and found it comfortable. "You are remarkably strange," he had informed her approximately 6 weeks after her arrival, in a tone that conveyed neither complaint nor judgment. "But you are precise. You do not complain during concentration hours, and you don't eat other people's food. I have decided you are acceptable." "I am overwhelmed by the warmth of that," Mirren had replied. "She has a sense of humor. Unexpected. But I'll take it." They had been something like friends since that day. Orvin knew a great many things about her. That she preferred north-facing windows, that she was faster with numerical records than correspondence, that she became very still when voices were raised unexpectedly nearby. He did not know about the crescent on the back of her neck. He did not know that on the day of the assessment the gift had broken through for half a second before she could contain it, and had shown her something she could not unknow. She had seen Valdrick's truth in one wordless, irreversible flash, frost spreading inward from his skin toward his heart, moving with the slow certainty of something that had been at work for a very long time. Not the cold of grief or temperament, the cold of a curse so old and deep it had begun to feel like the man's nature rather than something imposed upon it. A dying, quiet, and absolute that he himself had no language for, because he had never known himself any other way. She had spent all the years since being careful not to think about it directly. King Valdrick was present in the palace approximately 4 days out of every 7. She had learned his schedule through accumulated, involuntary observation, not because she was looking for him, but because she was paying close attention to everything at all times, and his patterns had emerged the way a familiar sound emerged from silence, impossible to unhear once noticed. She was aware of him the way a creature near still water was aware of a stone dropped into it, not by the stone itself, but by the ripples that preceded it. Her father's letters arrived twice a year, brief and without warmth, always ending the same way. Stay invisible, do not use the gift, and do not trust anyone. The most recent had arrived 9 days ago, the handwriting at the bottom smaller and more pressured than the rest. New hunters have been commissioned. They have a description. Be very careful, Myron. Do not give them anything to find. She had burned it before the candle wax beneath it cooled. The 9 days since had been spent recalibrating every habit, counting exits, varying her routes between the corridor and the archive, arriving and departing at shifted hours. She had been so focused on hunters coming from outside that she had made a mistake. She had stopped watching for what was already inside. It happened on an evening in late autumn. She had stayed later than usual in the records archive because the quarterly trade ledgers contained 3 separate transcription errors requiring tracing backward through 6 months of entries. Orvin had offered to stay and help. She had sent him away. The work required concentration she found easier alone, and she had learned not to allow extended proximity. Proximity bred familiarity. Familiarity bred curiosity. Curiosity was the one thing she could not afford. She had been alone for nearly 2 hours when she heard footsteps in the outer corridor. She catalogued sounds automatically. The quick stride of the Treasury officials, the lighter steps of household staff, the measured 2-count rhythm of the guards walking their evening circuit. These footsteps matched none of those patterns. Single set, deliberate and evenly spaced, the rhythm of someone accustomed to covering ground efficiently, moving along a corridor almost never used at this hour. Myron went very still over her ledger. The footsteps slowed. They stopped outside the archive door. The handle turned. The door opened. Myron had 3 seconds of clarity, cold and precise as a blade. She could not run without noise. She could not step back without drawing the eye. And her hair, was gathered and pinned at the nape of her neck because she had been alone for 2 hours and had stopped performing vigilance for no audience. She had pinned her hair. The realization moved through her in a wave that started in her chest and reached the ends of her fingers. She had pinned it because it kept falling across the columns of figures she was correcting, and she had been tired, and it had seemed a small thing, barely a decision at all. 3 years of unbroken discipline. 1 moment of exhausted carelessness. King Valdrick stepped into the archive. He was not in formal dress. He wore a dark coat, plain at the cut, and slightly worn at the collar, the kind a man put on when moving through his own palace late in the evening and expected no audience. His hair was less ordered than she had ever seen it, pushed back from his face in a way that made him look, for one disorienting moment, like a man who was tired rather than a king who governed everything he surveyed. He stopped when he saw her. Neither of them moved. "Scribe," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of someone who did not spend words on things that didn't require them. You are here late. Yes, Your Majesty. She kept her eyes level, her chin low. Her heart was striking the inside of her ribs with a force she was fairly certain could be heard in the deep quiet of the archive. The quarterly ledgers required corrections. I was tracing an error to its source. A pause. Which quarter? Third. The trade records from the southern provinces. 3 separate transcription errors in the original entries, all from the same hand. A misunderstanding of the recording format rather than carelessness. He moved to the far shelves, locating what he had come for with the easy familiarity of someone who had visited this room before, late and alone. She held the ledger in both hands and stared at the reading table and willed herself into furniture. How long have you served in the scribe's corridor? He asked, the tone of a question asked to fill silence. 3 years, Your Majesty. 3 years. He repeated it with a slight shift she could not quite read. And the errors you are correcting, are they your own? Not all of them. Some are from my first year. Most are from a predecessor who left before I arrived. A brief silence. Then, very quietly, something almost like dry amusement entered his voice. An honest answer. That is less common here than it ought to be. He was crossing back toward the door. She felt it in the change of the air, the withdrawal of his attention. He would leave. She needed him to leave before the cold draft came. The one that moved through the gap at the base of the far window when the temperature dropped after dark. The window gap exhaled. The cold draft crossed the room in one slow, indifferent gust. It lifted the loose strands at the back of her neck, shifted the pinned arrangement, and undid years of careful habit in less time than it took to register what was happening. She reached up, reflex, years of it firing without thought, and her hand closed over the back of her neck, half a second too late. The silence in the archive changed its character. It became the silence of someone who had seen something. Mirren stood with her hand pressed flat against the back of her neck and did not turn around. She did not breathe. She calculated every possible version of what happened next, and all of them arrived at the same end. He had not moved toward the door. The footsteps she had learned to recognize anywhere were absolutely still behind her, and his cold, that deep, unnatural cold she had catalogued on the very first day, reached her now with an intensity that said he was close and fully attending. Take your hand down, he said. Quiet. Perfectly even. The voice of a man who had not needed to raise it in a long time because raising it had never been required. Mirren did not move. I will not ask twice. She lowered her hand. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She waited for the word that would bring everything crashing down, the command for guards, the summoning of Sulwick, the procedural language of an arrest the law had been waiting to make. He said nothing. She heard him take one step toward her, then another. He stopped close enough that his cold reached her clearly, raising the fine hairs on her arms beneath her sleeves, that deep, bone-level cold that was not temperature but something far older. Turn around, he said. Mirren closed her eyes for one moment, then she turned. She had not looked at him directly in all the time she had been here. She had managed it through angles and distances and the disciplined avoidance of full eye contact, protecting herself from the gift that surfaced whenever she looked too long at something significant. Now there was no distance left to manage. King Valdrek of Threnor was standing 4 feet from her in a room lit by 2 low candles, and his expression was not what she had braced for. Not fury. Not the cold certainty of a man calculating how to dispose of a problem. Not even the blank composure he wore in public like a second face. He looked as though he had seen something that rearranged a room he thought he knew by heart. You, he said, almost to himself. You were in the assessment line, 3 years ago, 4th from the left. That he remembered was impossible. That he had catalogued her exact position was something she had no framework for. Yes, Your Majesty, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. His eyes moved over her features with the same economy he brought to everything, and she had the vertiginous sense of being genuinely seen for the first time since she had arrived. Not assessed for usefulness, not dismissed for insignificance. Seen. His gaze dropped briefly to the back of her neck. She watched his face. No disgust. No calculation of penalty. Something moved across his features and disappeared before it had fully resolved into an expression. The gift pressed at the edges of her awareness, straining upward. She held it back with everything she had. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mirren," she said. He regarded her for a long moment she could not read at all. Then, very quietly, "I am going to need you to come with me." He turned and walked toward the door with the certainty of a man who had not once in his life spoken a sentence, and then waited to see whether it would be obeyed. Mirren stood alone in the candlelit archive for the 3 seconds it took her to understand that she had no choice. She followed him into the dark corridor, and the archive door swung shut behind her with a sound like a sentence ending. He took her to his private study, not the council chamber, not the formal receiving room. The private study, the room behind the room, the one she had only heard referenced in oblique terms by senior staff. The room where the king actually thought. It was smaller than she had imagined. Books on every wall, organized by some internal logic she could not immediately parse. A single desk near the window, its surface covered in maps and annotated documents. A fire burning low in the hearth. Valdrek closed the door behind her. He did not sit. He stood near the desk with his arms crossed, his cold, a steady presence in the room, and looked at her in the direct, unhurried way she had no defense against. "Sit," he said. She sat in the chair near the fire. He remained standing. "How long have you been inside this palace?" he said. Not a question. A measurement. 3 years, Mirren said. A silence. He absorbed this with no visible reaction. Everything went in. Nothing came back out until he had finished processing it. "And in 3 years, he said, you used the gift how often?" "I cannot always prevent it from surfacing, Your Majesty. When it does, I see things I did not ask to see. I have learned to manage it, not eliminate it." "What have you seen?" he said, quieter now. "About me." The fire snapped once and settled. "Your Majesty," Mirren said, "before I answer that, I would like to know what you intend to do with me." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, but a quality of attention that sharpened slightly. The look of a man who found an unexpected deviation genuinely interesting rather than inconvenient. "That depends," he said, "on what you tell me." "Then I would suggest we establish terms first." He studied her for a moment that stretched past comfort. Then, slowly, something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "An honest answer," he said, echoing what he had said in the archive. She recognized the deliberate callback, that he had filed it and retrieved it without effort. "That is less common here than it ought to be." He straightened. "You will not be arrested tonight. You will not be reported to the council or the hunters. In return, you will tell me what you have seen and agree to tell me more when I require it." They were not equal terms. She had nothing to negotiate with, and they both knew it. But she had spent years measuring the difference between coldness born of cruelty and coldness born of other things, and what she heard in his voice was not malice. "I agree," she said. "Then tell me what you have seen." She took a breath and told him. She described the cold as the gift had shown it to her. Not illness, not injury, not the natural decline of age. A structured, deliberate thing moving inward from the perimeter of his body toward the center, following a pattern too precise to be accidental. Something placed rather than something that had grown. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It had weight. "How long have you known this?" he said, and his voice had changed in a way she could not name. 3 years. She watched something move through his expression that he could not contain, something older than anger and more complex than fear. He turned away and stood facing the window. She could see the set of his shoulders, the hard, still line of his back, and she understood that she had just handed him 3 years of knowledge about himself that he had been living without. "You will come tomorrow evening," he said, his voice restored. "Same hour." "Yes, Your Majesty." The door opened from outside. His chief advisor, Sulwick, spare, watchful, a man whose intelligence was housed in a face built for suspicion, stepped inside and stopped when he saw her. His gaze moved to Myron with the quick, categorizing attention of someone who had spent decades identifying misplaced things. "Your Majesty," Sulwick said, carrying the shape of a question without technically asking one. "She is leaving," Valdric said, without turning from the window. "See that she gets back to the scribe's corridor undisturbed." The word undisturbed carried the full weight of an instruction. Sulwick's eyes moved back to Mirren with an expression she noted and filed away. A man who had not been given an explanation and did not like it. Mirren rose and crossed the room. At the door she paused, some impulse prompting her to look back. Valdric was still facing the window. The firelight reached only partway across the room, and beyond its edge he stood in the dark, one hand pressed flat against the glass, his cold radiating outward in the stillness. He was profoundly, unutterably alone. Mirren turned away. She followed Sulwick into the corridor, and the study door closed behind her. She lay awake until dawn, and by the stillness of the palace, by the absence of any sound of movement from the floors above, she understood that wherever he was not sleeping either. She returned the following evening, and the one after that. It became a thing without a name, not official, not announced, not recorded in any document. Valdric had not told his advisors. Mirren had not told Orvin. There was no title for what she was doing, and no formal arrangement beyond the terms of that first night, which were clear in their structure and wholly inadequate at capturing what the evenings in the private study actually were. She had expected interrogation. She had prepared for it, organized her observations into ordered categories, anticipated the questions a methodical man would ask about something he had never been given language for. She had not prepared for him to listen. Not in the performative way of a man waiting for useful information to surface. He listened the way she had noticed he read. Completely, without dividing his attention, giving the thing in front of him his full consideration, as if nothing else in the room existed. When she spoke, he was still. When she paused to find the right word, he did not fill the silence impatiently. When she said something that contradicted what he believed, he did not dismiss it. He sat with it, turned it over in the way of someone genuinely testing a new piece against the existing structure of what he knew. It was disarming. She had not anticipated being disarmed. She told him what the gift showed her about the curse, the pattern of it, its direction, the way it responded to different conditions. On evenings when he had spent the day in extended council sessions, the cold was marginally deeper. On evenings when he had been writing, she could tell by his posture the way outdoor cold sat differently on a person than the cold that came from within. It had receded slightly, as though motion delayed it. "It responds to stillness," she told him near the end of the second week. "Meaning what?" "Precisely. When the day requires you to be stationary, deliberative, contained, it advances. When you are truly in motion, it pauses." She paused herself. "I do not know if that is useful." "It explains something I had noticed and could not account for," he said. "That I sleep better on evenings when I have been on horseback. I had attributed it to physical exhaustion." He looked at the fire. "It appears I was wrong." That he had been tracking symptoms at all, silently and alone, for what she suspected was a very long time, was something she held quietly and did not remark on. In the third week, he began asking questions that had nothing to do with the curse. It started with a question about the southern trade ledgers, and expanded, through follow-up and counter-question, into an hour's conversation about the structural inefficiencies she had identified across years of managing records. He listened to all of it. At the end of the evening, without preamble, he said, "The observation about the regional scribes using inconsistent dating formats. Document it formally. Bring it to me next week." Not a request. In the fourth week, she arrived to find the chair across from his had been moved, pulled slightly closer to his side of the hearth, repositioned at a different angle. A small change, the kind made without quite meaning to, simply adjusting the room to match what the room had been doing for weeks without the furniture having caught up. She sat in it without commenting. He did not comment either, but she noticed. She noticed that he now had a second candelabra lit on the evenings she came, making the room brighter than he would have kept it alone. She noticed the documents he had set aside for her attention, flagged with strips of paper bearing his handwriting. She noticed the one evening when Sulwick had appeared at the study door, and Valdric had said, with pleasant finality, "Not tonight," and Sulwick had gone. The gift, which she had kept at arm's length for so long, was showing her things she had not given it permission to show. Not the curse. Something softer. It showed her the texture of a man who had been alone for a very long time and had organized his entire life around that aloneness in a way that made it look like preference. She did not tell him this, nor did she tell him the full truth about the timeline. The gift gave her timelines and impressions rather than measurements, but she had translated those impressions into something precise enough to frighten her. At the current rate of progression, he had perhaps 6 months before the cold reached the center of him. What happened then? The gift showed her in images. A king still seated on his throne, still governing, still breathing, but hollowed at the core. Not dead. Something she thought might be worse than dead. Present and absent simultaneously. A man behind glass, permanently. She had been carrying this for 4 weeks and said nothing, and she knew exactly why, and that knowledge was its own silent indictment. In the 6th week, she met Lord Dravon of the Eastern Court. Their first encounter was a passing moment in the corridor outside the council chamber. He studied her with the comprehensive assessment she had learned to recognize as the gaze of someone who catalogued people as potential instruments, and she looked back with the practiced blankness she had spent years perfecting. But his gaze snagged on something. She felt it. The quality of attention that was looking, rather than merely seeing. And she kept her pace even and her chin at the right angle, and she turned the corner and did not look back. That evening she arrived at the study 3 minutes late, having taken a longer route to confirm she was not being followed. Valdric noticed immediately. "You are late." "I took a longer route." She hesitated, then decided against the easier answer. "Lord Dravon was in the outer corridor this afternoon. He looked at me the way people look when they have already started a question they haven't asked yet." Valdric was very still for a moment. "Dravon," he said, "I may be wrong." "You are rarely wrong about how people look at you," he said, an observation formed over weeks of watching her read rooms with consistent accuracy. He was quiet for a moment. "I will deal with it." She did not ask him to clarify what, precisely, he considered his concern. 2 days later, Orvin appeared at her desk with the expression he used for information he was uncertain he should have. "Dravon was removed from the Intelligence Council this morning," he said. "Effective immediately. No stated reason. Nobody asked questions, because nobody ever asks questions when it happens that quickly." He paused. "That is 2 things in 6 weeks that I am choosing not to ask follow-up questions about." "You are developing admirable restraint," Mirren said. "It is quite exhausting," he agreed. That evening she arrived at the study, and Valdric did not mention Dravon, and she did not mention Dravon, and they worked through a foreign policy document together for 2 hours. Her flagging the clauses carrying emotional subtext the drafters had tried to obscure in formal language, him listening and asking pointed questions. And at the end of it he refilled the cup she had been given, quietly. simply reaching for the decanter before she had noticed it was empty. And she understood, with the quiet, unstoppable certainty of something that had been true longer than she had admitted it, that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind she had been managing for 3 years. The other kind. She went back to the scribe's corridor and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and had a very direct conversation with herself about the categories of mistake she could not afford to make, and the feelings she needed to stop having. She was seerborn. She was crescent-marked. She was, under the law of Thranor, a condemned criminal living on borrowed time inside the palace of the king who should have had her arrested. Caring about him was not a complication she could survive. She told herself this clearly and completely. She was very thorough about it. Then she lay down, stared at the ceiling, and admitted to herself that thorough had never once been sufficient against the way Valdric looked at her, when his attention was fully and completely directed at her face. She did not sleep for a long time, and in the morning, carrying her documents toward the council wing, she was aware that Draven was gone, but the threat was not. Men like Draven, removed from councils quickly and without explanation, did not disappear quietly. They made plans. Drevon's plan took 3 weeks to surface. When it did, it arrived not through the channels she had been watching, not through hunters, not through formal complaint, but through a sealed letter delivered to King Valdric's private correspondence before the morning assembly. Solwick read it first, placed it on the king's desk with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided how much expression to allow. She was in the council chambers when Valdric read it, and she had spent months learning the vocabulary of his expressions, the small shifts most people never saw. She saw the moment his eyes reached the relevant section. She saw the stillness that followed, the bedrock a man fell back on when the upper layers had been knocked clean. He folded the letter, placed it face down, looked up at the room with the expression he wore in formal sessions, smooth and unreadable. "We will begin the Eastern Border Review," he said. She documented the session with the same unhurried hand she always used, and when it concluded 2 hours later, she gathered her materials and was the third person to leave the chamber, unremarkable, the woman the eye passed over. That evening, she arrived at the study to find Valdric standing at the window exactly as she had found him on the first night, his back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the glass. The fire was burning low. He had not added wood to it. She crossed to the hearth, added 2 logs without being asked, and sat down. He did not turn around for a long time. "Drevon has filed a formal accusation with the High Charter," he said finally. His voice was level, but she had learned to hear what lay beneath. Controlled fury and something else she identified as fear, which she had never once heard from him before. 3 witnesses attest to having observed the crescent mark during your tenure in the palace. He has cited the decree. He has called for immediate execution under the terms of Article 9. A pause. He filed it yesterday. I received it this morning. The fire crackled. A bell struck the half-hour somewhere in the palace. "I see," Mirren said. He turned from the window, and the expression on his face was not the smooth blank of the public man or the neutral composure of the private one. It was the face of a man who had run out of managed distance and was standing on ground he did not recognize. "I can overrule the charter," he said. "A king's decree supersedes Article 9 with sufficient cause. I can do it tonight." "And the cause you would cite?" The question landed in the silence between them with the weight of everything that had accumulated across months of evenings and repositioned chairs and small, careful, uncategorized gestures. "That you have been of material service to the crown," he said. "That is a cause," she said. "Is it the cause?" The fire had built properly now, and in the orange light she watched Valdric look at her the way he had on the first night. Directly, completely, with none of the managed distance she had watched him apply to everything else in his life. "No," he said. "It is not the cause." She let the gift rise. Let it show her what it had been trying to show her for weeks. And what she saw made her throat tighten with a pain she was not prepared for. The cold had reached his chest, not approaching. Arrived. Weeks ahead of the trajectory she had been tracking. It had advanced while she was counting evenings and refilled cups and telling herself that what she felt each time he said her name was simply gratitude. And she had missed it because she had stopped looking at the curse with any clinical precision at all. She was on her feet before she knew she was moving. "Valdrek," she said. "Not your majesty, just his name, plain and irretrievable." But she did not have space for the flinch of protocol because the cold was sitting directly over his heart. He went very still at the sound of his name in her voice. "How long has your chest felt tight?" she said. Something moved in his face. How long?" "2 weeks," he said. "I thought it was fatigue." 2 weeks. He had been carrying it alone, coming to the study each evening with his hand occasionally pressed to his ribs when he thought she was not looking, and she had noticed and said nothing because she had not wanted to look at it clearly and find what she was now finding. She crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from him, closer than she had ever let herself stand. "I need to tell you something about the timeline," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I was not as precise as I should have been. I am sorry." He looked down at her. The cold radiating from him was the strongest she had ever felt it, and she felt it differently now than she had on the very first day. Not as a symptom she was cataloging from a safe distance, but as something taking something away from her personally. "Tell me now," he said. She told him the real timeline, the impressions the gift had been giving her for weeks, that she had been softening into optimism, what the final stage looked like. And she kept her eyes on his face as she described it and did not look away. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "You have known this for weeks," he said. "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No." She held his gaze. "Because I was looking at you instead of the curse, and I should not have let those become separate categories. That was my failure." A long moment passed. Then he said very quietly, "It is not a failure I can find it in myself to be angry about." She had been bracing for something, not anger exactly, but his controlled version of it. She had no response for what she received instead. The gift rose fully and showed her the truth of him in one wordless instant. The curse, and behind it, the man. And behind the man, the years of accumulated aloneness that had settled into the shape of his bones, and sitting at the center of all of it, recent enough to still carry warmth, the light of someone who has found one thing in a long span of darkness and begun, quietly and against all prior evidence, to rely on it. She understood that she was the thing. She pressed the gift back down with hands that were not quite steady. "There is something else you need to know. Say," she said, "about the curse, about what it requires to break." She steadied her breath. The curse was not placed by an external practitioner acting alone. It was anchored to a physical object, a binding relic, the kind only a living seer can locate, because a seer is the only practitioner whose gift can find the frequency of an anchored curse and follow it back to its source. She paused. Without a seer, the object cannot be found. Without the object, the curse cannot be broken. The room was absolutely still. "You are the only seer I have access to," he said, "and under the terms of Article 9, I am scheduled for execution, which will be processed within 48 hours unless you file the overrule tonight." She met his eyes directly. "Which means, you need to decide something before morning." He did not look away. The cold was a physical presence in the narrow space between them, and she read the understanding move through him. The law and the curse, and the woman who was the only answer to one and the stated subject of the other. "I need you to understand something first," he said, his voice dropping to the register she had only heard in the most unguarded moments, low, stripped of the distance he carried like armor. "The overrule I file tonight will not cite material service to the Crown." She waited. "It will cite," he said, with the precision of a man choosing words that cannot be taken back, "that you are under my personal protection." that you have been since the night in the archive, and that any further action against you will be treated as a direct action against the crown itself." Her throat had closed. "You should understand what that declaration means publicly," he continued, "before you ask me to make it." "I understand what it means," she said. His eyes held hers. "Then I am past the point of pretending that my interest in keeping you alive is administrative." She had kept her head down for 3 years. She had kept it down because looking up meant being seen, and being seen meant being found, and being found had always meant destruction. She looked up. "Then file the overrule," she said, "and tomorrow night I will find the relic." He was quiet for one long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the finality of a man who had made his decision and was done. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. She turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard him already moving to his desk, the quiet of a man sitting down to write something he intended to finish before he slept. In the corridor, she stopped and pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed once, slowly, from the base of her ribs. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. She found the relic in 4 hours, not through searching. The palace was too large and the night too short for that. She found it the way the gift had always worked when she stopped fighting it and let it move. She sat in the center of the empty study in the small hours and opened herself completely, all the containment released, all those years of disciplined suppression lifted in one deliberate act, and she let the gift go where it needed to go. It was like releasing a bowstring held taut for years without being fired. The sensation was not gentle. It moved through her with a force that blurred her vision and rang in her bones. And then it focused, honed itself to a single line of awareness that pulled like a compass needle, steady and insistent, drawing her gaze downward and to the left, toward the subterranean levels of the palace that predated the current structure by several centuries. She followed it. Down staircases she had never used, through a sealed door, through a low corridor that smelled of stone so old it had gone past damp into mineral dryness. The smell of a place sealed from time rather than merely from traffic. The gift led her to a room no larger than a wardrobe, empty except for a stone shelf built into the far wall. On the shelf, wrapped in cloth gone almost colorless with age, a small carved disc approximately the size of a closed fist. She could feel it before she touched it. The cold emanating from it was the same cold she had felt radiating from Valdrek since the first day. The same quality, the same depth, and the recognition of it landed in her chest with a weight that was almost grief. This small, ordinary-looking thing. This was what had been taking him apart, piece by piece, for his entire life. This was what had taken every king before him. This was what would take his son, and his son's son, if she did not end it now. She picked it up. The cold moved up her arms like water finding a gradient, and she felt the gift rise to meet it. The seer instinct orienting toward the curse, the way a healer's hands oriented toward injury. She felt the structure of it. Old, dense, layered in the way of something built by a practitioner of significant power who had constructed redundancies specifically to prevent dismantling. Meticulous work. The work of someone who intended it to last. She sat down on the stone floor with the disc in both hands and she began. The gift worked differently at full strength and full intention than it did when it surfaced involuntarily. It was not passive reading, it was contact. Direct engagement with the thing she was examining, the seer's capacity to perceive the full truth of something and, in perceiving it completely, dissolve the structure of it. This was what the law feared. This was what the Hunters and Article 9 were built to prevent. The binding did not yield quickly. She had not expected it to. She worked through the night with the cold moving through her and the gift burning at full capacity for the first time in her life. Not fragments. Not controlled releases. The whole of it, applied without reservation to the thing that had been killing him 1 degree of warmth at a time. Her mind moved to the evenings in the study. The repositioned chair. The way he said her name in the council chambers when he wanted precision. Just Myron. And the way it sounded in the study when he was not managing anything, which was also just Myron but landed somewhere it had no business landing. She worked through the cold and the exhaustion that arrived after the second hour and settled into her limbs like wet sand. When the binding pushed back, a genuine recoil, resisting rupture, she held her ground and pressed deeper, and she thought about the frost over his heart, and she did not stop. The binding broke near dawn. It broke without drama. No sound, no visible change, just a shift in what she was holding. The cold in the disc went from active to inert in the space of a single breath, the way a fire went from flame to ash, and the silence left behind was the silence of something that had, after a very long time, stopped. She sat on the stone floor for a moment. Then she put the disc in the fold of her coat and went upstairs to find him. She found him at his desk with the overrule documentation in front of him, already sealed with the king's mark. He had written it, sealed it, and then stayed at his desk, which told her everything about how he had spent the night. He glanced up when she came in. She crossed the room and placed the disc on the desk in front of him. His gaze moved from the disc to her face and back, reading both. The disc was inert now, no cold emanating from it, no trace of the thing it had been. An old carved object from a sealed room beneath the palace. Nothing more. "Is it done?" he said. "It's done. The binding is broken." She paused. "Completely. Not just yours. The root structure of it. The bloodline binding. It will not carry to any descendant." He was very still. She watched the cold leave him for the first time. It moved back slowly, the way frost retreated from glass when warmth finally reached it. From the edges first, then from the center. And what remained in its absence was simply warmth. The natural warmth of a living man that should have been there all along and had never once been permitted. He raised his hand and looked at it, turned it over slowly, the way a man examined something familiar that had changed in a way he was still accounting for. "I have been cold," he said quietly, "for as long as I can remember." "I know," she said. The gray eyes she had spent months reading in fragments looked different in the dawn light. The same color, the same directness, but the quality behind them had shifted. The sense of something held at a guarded distance, held there so long it had calcified into the architecture of his face, was simply gone. "You used the gift fully," he said. "Not managed. Fully." "Yes. That is precisely what Article 9 was written to prevent." "I know that too," she said. "I judged it was worth the risk." He reached across the desk, picked up the sealed overrule and held it so she could see her name on it. "I filed this tonight on the terms I told you I would use," he said. "Before I knew what you were going to do. Before I knew you would use the gift fully and give me a cleaner legal argument." He set it down. "I want you to understand that." She understood. He was telling her that the protection had not been transactional, had not been issued because she was useful, and would be revoked when usefulness ended. He was telling her, in the unembellished, direct way he communicated everything that mattered to him, that it had been personal before it was practical, and would remain personal regardless of what the practical situation did. Her throat was very tight. "Valdrek," she said. He stood. He came around the desk and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him in the full dawn light coming through the window, and there was nothing between them except the small remaining distance that either of them could close. "You have been in my palace for 3 years, he said, keeping your head down, looking at nothing. "Yes," she said. "I spent 3 years walking past you," he said, "and I remembered where you stood." She had no words for that. She stood in the warmth of him, present now, genuinely warm for the first time, and let it be true. He reached out and pushed the dark fall of her hair back from her neck, gently and deliberately, and looked at the crescent mark without any of the things she had been bracing against her entire life. No disgust, no fear, no calculation of what it meant for him politically. He looked at it the way he had looked at the overruled documentation, as something that had his name on it, as something he had decided was his concern. His hand curved around the back of her neck, cool now in the simple way of human skin, rather than the deep cold she had been cataloging for years. And he tilted her face up, and she let him, and the kiss was unhurried and certain, and carried the quality of something that had been decided very thoroughly, long before it was expressed. 6 weeks later, the seer-born decree was repealed. It was not a quiet repeal. Valdrek brought it to the full council with the sealed overrule and the broken relic, and a legal argument so sharply written it left no ground to contest. He presented it as a man who had not come to negotiate but to inform, and when Sulwick, watchful, skeptical Sulwick, who had been waiting for the problem Mirren represented to make itself fully apparent, began to speak, Valdrek looked at him and said simply, "No." Sulwick sat back and said nothing further. He was a man who read where power resided and adapted accordingly. He would take longer than most, but he would adapt. The repeal passed that afternoon with 5 abstentions and no formal dissent. Orvin appeared at her desk the following morning with the look of a man who had been doing mathematics for several weeks and had finally arrived at a total he found both logical and somewhat extraordinary. "I am going to ask a follow-up question," he said. "All right," Mirren said. "Are you," he said, "going to be in the scribe's corridor much longer?" She considered this. Down the corridor, the King of Threnor had been walking past the corridor entrance each morning for 6 weeks, not stopping, because neither of them had found the right shape yet for what came after a 3-year concealment and a night spent breaking an ancient curse on a stone floor, but pausing briefly in the manner of a man who was not walking past at all, but simply practicing patience while the correct form of things made itself apparent. "Not much longer," she said. Orvin nodded with the settled satisfaction of a man whose mathematics had proven correct. "Good," he said. "The ledgers will suffer without you. But some things matter more than ledgers." "That may be the warmest thing you have ever said to me." "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation." In the afternoon, she was summoned to the study, formally, with a written request in Valdrek's hand. She arrived to find him standing at the window as he had stood on the first night, and the second, and the night she had told him the true timeline of the curse, each time different and each time carrying the weight of something being decided. She stood in the center of the room and waited. He turned from the window. He was warm in the light, visibly, undeniably warm, the warmth of a man whose body was finally operating as it had always been designed to, and she found herself looking at him the way the gift had always looked at things that mattered, completely and without the instinct to look away. "I would like to make a different arrangement," he said. "What arrangement?" "Kay," she said. He told her. She stood and listened to it. Practical in its language, exact in its terms, wholly characteristic of a man who communicated love the way he communicated policy, through careful documentation and clear conditions, and the certainty of someone who had thought it through completely and was done. The arrangement he proposed was permanent and left nothing ambiguous, and buried in the formal language was everything he had been building toward across months of evenings and repositioned chairs and a protection order filed before dawn. When he finished, she said, "Yes." He was still for a moment. Then he said, with the dry precision she had learned early was his expression of something he felt deeply, "I had prepared a significantly longer argument." "I know," she said. "I could tell it was going to be thorough." "It was very thorough," he said. "Then consider it heard," she said, and agreed to. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him and thought about 3 years of keeping her head down, of practicing the art of being overlooked, of building herself so carefully into the architecture of invisibility that she had sometimes wondered, alone in the dark of the scribe's corridor, whether she had disappeared so thoroughly that she no longer existed in any form that could be found. But he had found her. He had found her in a cold archive on an autumn evening with her hair pinned up for the first time in years, and he had remembered her position in a line from a day 3 years before that. And he had spent a winter and a spring and the beginning of a summer figuring out the right arrangement of words for something she apparently already knew. She reached up and took his face in both hands, and she said his name once, simply, the way she had said it the night everything changed, and she felt him settle into that, into the warmth of being named plainly by someone who meant it, the way a person settled into a room they had finally come to understand was theirs. Outside the study window, the palace of Threnor moved through the business of an ordinary afternoon. The hunters rode out on the eastern road and came back with nothing, because there was nothing any more to find. In the scribe's corridor, Orvin cross-referenced a quarterly ledger with the resigned efficiency of a man who knew he would be doing it alone from now on, and had decided this was acceptable. In the private study, behind the closed door, King Valdrek of Threnor, warm now, finally and completely warm, held the woman who had kept his secret for 3 years before he knew he needed her to, and neither of them kept their head down at all. Thank you for listening to this story. If it found you at the right moment, I hope it stays with you. Leave me a comment. I read every single one, and they mean more than you know.